Hi, everyone. So now we're talking the terminology of anatomy, specifically human anatomy. And this is going to be very helpful for you in transitioning to becoming a true scientist. The fact that you can communicate effectively and without ambiguity when it is in terms of location of organs and tissues. So we've studied tissues, we've studied cells, now we're studying organs, and we need to be able to communicate their locations. We do this through anatomical terminology when it comes to large bodies of animals and of humans. So this describes the relationship of body parts and locations relative to other locations. And we're always talking in terms of relationships in this. So you can really impress others and avoid ambiguity by using these standardized terms. When we talk about anatomical position for the human body, we're talking about a body that is upright and the head is erect, the eyes are forward, the arms are at the sides, and here's the important one, the palms are facing up. Very important. This is called the palmar surface. The palms are facing up, the feet are flat on a surface. That is anatomical position for a human, for a bipedal animal. And when we talk about this position, we talk about it in terms of planes. And there are three basic planes. There are more than that. We'll talk about three basic planes to discuss bipedal humans. And broadly, we'll start and then we'll narrow in and funnel it down. But there are two vertical planes and one horizontal plane. Horizontal meaning it's along the horizon. The vertical planes are known as the sagittal plane, and that sagittal plane goes from the center of wisdom, sagittos, down to the feet. And there is a frontal plane which goes from half of your skull down through half of your body to divide the front and half of your body. We're going to get a lot more specific about that in a few minutes. There is also a horizontal plane which divides your body in half around the abdomen or the umbilicus. Let's go into a little bit more detail. When we talk about the sagittal plane, the plane of wisdom right straight through your brain, that will divide your body into right and left areas. And that will be right or left by your own or the body's aspect. So you know your right from your left, and you know when you look at somebody, you are flipping that direction. So you are talking about their right and their left. You're flipping it. That's a tough thing. You may have to really concentrate on that. I know that I need to really concentrate on that. The sagittal plane divides the body into right and left hemispheres, if you like. Let's keep going. When we talk about the right and left hemispheres, we talk about them in relationship to the plane. And we don't talk about the sagittal plane too much. We talk about midline that goes between your eyes, between your nostrils, between your lungs, and down between your legs. This is midline of the body along the sagittal plane. When we talk about midline, we talk about references to it like medial and lateral. And when we talk about medial, we're thinking about it in terms of relativity. We're thinking of a surface that is closer to midline than your arm, or closer to the midline than the outside of your leg. That's a medial surface, closer to midline. It's all relative. These are in degrees. So for instance, your heart is medial to your shoulder. Your heart is closer to midline. And your hand out here, and comparing that to your lung, your lung is closer to medial, or your lung is medial to your arm, okay, closer to midline. When we think of lateral, we think of farther away from midline. In other words, your shoulder is lateral to your lung. It's farther away from midline. These are all relative and all in degrees, and you can think of surfaces of organs. For instance, there's one surface of your lung that is medial to another surface of your lung. All relative. And in terms of that, we can also look at directionality of these relationships. We have another term, proximal versus distal. Proximal means closer to the point of attachment. The shoulder is attached, is an attached arm. The shoulder is proximal to the fingers. And distal is farther from the point of attachment at the trunk. So your fingers are distal to your shoulder. Again, these are all degrees. You could have a surface that is proximal to the point of attachment, and you could have a surface that is distal to the point of attachment. And you might describe just about any event as being proximal or distal when you're talking about the arms especially, and the legs, when you're talking about the appendages. And when we go to our next plane, plane number 2, which is another vertical plane, this plane divides a bipedal body into front and back. This is called the frontal plane. It goes from the middle of your skull down through your shoulders, down through your abdomen, down through your legs. This is the frontal plane. The frontal plane. Sometimes it is called the coronal plane, and that is from the Latin word for crown, which would go around the front and the back of your head. So sometimes you may hear it known as the coronal plane. We don't talk about front and back when it comes to biology. We use other terms. You may hear these other terms, and well, you will hear these other terms, so you really do need to understand them. Let's start at the front. The front is the anterior surface of the bipedal body. You will often hear of anterior. And that can also be known as ventral. Now, here's the way to understand that ventral is anterior. Ventral sounds like ventilation, right? Ventilation, wind going in and out. Well, guess where your lungs are? Your lungs ventilate your body. Your lungs are in the anterior plane of your body. So please remember that. Anterior is front, is ventral on the coronal plane or the frontal plane. Let's go to the back. The back is the posterior. That's pretty easy to remember, anterior and posterior. You'll often hear it called, especially in animals that are not human, you'll hear it called dorsal. How are you going to remember it's dorsal? Remember this, that is related to dormant. It's the same root word in Latin, dormant, and that is like sleeping, and usually in good anatomical position, you sleep on your back. So posterior is back of the frontal plane and is often called dorsal side or dorsal plane, especially in animals, and we'll get to animals in a few minutes. Let's keep going, and we are going to talk about our horizontal plane. Our horizontal plane is sometimes called the horizontal plane, but not among scientists. It's called the transverse plane. Remember, trans as in across as in transportation, moving things from one port across to another port, transportation. So this is the transverse plane, generally at the umbilicus, and it divides the body into an upper half and a lower half, but we don't use those words. In science and in biology, we use the words superior, as in the superior plane of the transverse plane, or the superior aspect of the transverse plane, and the inferior aspect of the transverse plane. That's pretty easy to remember, but there's more. In animals, you will not hear it referred to as superior and inferior. So if you want to go to vet school, you need to instead talk about cranial, and that is as in brain, cranium, you know, that game, cranium, that's your brain. That is the cranial aspect of the transverse plane. Or caudal. Caudal is tougher to remember. Caudal is a word in Latin that means tail. If we talk about the lower half of the body, that's the half that usually contains the tail. In fact, we have an old tailbone, our coccyx. It is in the caudal aspect of the transverse plane. So we've got two vertical planes. We have got the plane that is right here, the frontal plane. Over here we had the sagittal plane, right straight through midline, and we have one horizontal plane, which is the transverse plane. Know your areas of, and I'll just go over this with you one more time. Know your areas in terms of right and left of midline in the sagittal plane. Know it, study it. And in terms of know your anterior or ventral in terms of the frontal plane, and your posterior or dorsal in terms of the back of your frontal plane. And when it comes to transverse, know your superior aspect of your transverse plane, which is also called your cranial aspect, and know your inferior aspect, or your caudal or tailbone aspect. It's a tough word. I can't give you anything else for caudal. There really is no other term besides the Latin. Now, let's go to animals next.